It's the Brian Lehrer Show on WNYC. Good morning again, everyone. Now we continue our WNYC Centennial Series, 100 Years of 100 Things. Today it's thing number 61, 100 Years of Psychoanalysis and Psychotherapy. Sigmund Freud was in his heyday of influence in 1925. He published a book that year called The Resistance to Psychoanalysis. Over the last century, of course, the field of study and of practice that Freud set in motion has undergone many changes, including repudiation of some of Freud's own ideas. Today, a variety of kinds of talk therapy are widely in use. The American Psychological Association lists psychoanalysis and psychodynamic therapies as one category. Also behavior therapy, cognitive therapy, humanistic, gestalt, holistic, integrative, and existential therapy as various primary examples. So let's talk about 100 years of psychoanalysis and psychotherapy with Paul Bloom, professor of psychology at the University of Toronto, professor emeritus of psychology at Yale. He's the author or editor of 8 books, including, most relevant to this segment, Psych, The Story of the Human Mind, which came out in 2023. He deals not only with individual psychotherapy, but also the field's relationship to understanding some of today's social and political concerns. And, of course, we live at a time when mental health crises of various kinds are considered widespread reflections of today's world. Professor Bloom, thanks for joining us for this. Welcome back to WNYC.
Thanks so much for having me back.
And listeners, as we like to do in these 100-year segments, we invite your oral history calls. And we would love to hear from people for this one who practice psychotherapy of any kind. How does the history of the field influence how you practice today? Did you come up through school learning about the history? Share some of that with us. Have there been schools of psychological thought from the last 100 years that you've mostly embraced or mostly rejected for your own practice? And how do you use tools from more than one of those schools of thought, if you do, to create the best practice in your practice? 212-433-WNYC, 212-433-9692. Again, we'd love to hear from people who practice psychotherapy of any kind. How does the history of the field influence how you practice today? Have there been schools of psychological thought from the last 100 years that you've mostly embraced or mostly rejected, or use a few of them in conjunction with each other for a best practice of your own? 212-433-WNYC, 212-433-9692. Now, Professor Bloom, I'm going to play a clip of Freud speaking on the BBC in 1938. The audio is really bad, but just so people can hear his voice for a few seconds. He says here, "I discovered some important and new facts about the unconscious in psychic life, the role of instinctual urges, and so on."
I discovered some important new facts about the unconscious in psychic life, the role of instinctual urges, and so on.
So a rare audio clip of Sigmund Freud on the BBC in 1938. So give us that part of the history as you understand it, Professor. How much did Freud discover, as he put it, some important and new facts about the unconscious in psychic life and create a 20th century science that didn't previously exist?
It's a great question. I think a lot of people listening to this are going to be surprised to hear that from the standpoint of the science of psychology, and I'm a research scientist, not a therapist, Freud is mostly seen as an embarrassment. A lot of his ideas are seen as ridiculous, and I think rightfully so. And just about all of his specific claims about mental illness, about development, about sexuality, are seen as just entirely mistaken and sometimes silly and embarrassing.
Things like I think the Oedipal complex.
Yeah,
and,
exactly. Penis envy.
Okay, I was going to say it in a whitewashed way, but yeah. So that things like that. But go ahead.
Yeah, and there's very little evidence for these things. But I actually am somewhat of a defender of Freud. I think it's an overreaction. I think that although the specifics were wrong, there's a core idea he had which persists. I think it's right. I think it's important. And this is the idea that we have unconscious motivations and desires. That when it comes to even the most important decisions of our lives, like who we love and what we do for a living and what pursuits we take on, we're driven by forces that we're not often conscious of. So you might think you love somebody for such and so reason. You might just be wrong. You might be wrong in your guesses as to why you vote the way you do and why you chose the job that you do. And we owe a lot to Freud here. He's not the first to think about the unconscious, but he turned it into a science. And I think there's sort of an unacknowledged debt to Freud and modern psychology.
What kinds of unhappinesses, if that's the right word, was Freud dealing with in his time? Let's say, I know he started before 1925, but let's say around the time 100 years ago, in relation to what we discussed today. If today we use terms like anxiety and depression and things like that as being fairly widespread, or terms that people would have a basic understanding of and recognize, what was it then?
The terms were different. He talked in terms of neuroses, which is a term that I think people still use, but it isn't used much by professional psychologists. But to some extent, if you hear the stories of Freud's patients and the people he worked with, they'll sound familiar to you. We wouldn't use the same language to describe them. We wouldn't say they suffer from depression or anxiety disorder. He would use different language. But they talked about troubles with everyday life, problems with relationships, often obsessions, often weird phobias. And Freud's approach to dealing with this was what he called a talking cure, which is, he talked to them and tried to figure out what the underlying nature of their problems was. And with the idea that if they understand what's up with them, if they understand the hidden forces that gave rise to the problems would pretty much go away. And I think many psychologists, as you say, still talk to patients. If you're seeing somebody right now, there's probably a lot of talking going on. It tends not to be focused that much on the sort of hidden realms of the unconscious. Often psychologists now do, as you say, cognitive behavioral therapy. They focus on how to improve your life in the concrete ways, techniques and ways to deal with your problems. But still, there's some continuity from how Freud dealt with his patients to how people deal with their patients right now.
Psychoanalysis, as we call it. So maybe you can define that. Psychoanalysis, as he might have used the term 100 years ago, and if the book that he released exactly 100 years ago in 1925 was called Resistance to Psychoanalysis, what was psychoanalysis and what came next?
You probably know for psychoanalysis from old movies. Psychoanalysis, your patient comes in, they lie on the couch, they talk, the therapist goes, takes down notes, occasionally says something wise. In orthodox psychoanalysis, you might go 5 days a week, an hour a day. And the idea is you totally get your mind worked out. You go through, you figure out the unconscious dynamics that are ruling you. And I think there's still some psychoanalysis today. I used to live in New Haven. There were a couple of psychoanalysts, or many psychoanalysts in Manhattan now. It is not a popular movement. It's not popular because it's time consuming, it's difficult, it's expensive, and it may not be as useful, or at least not as quickly useful as other techniques.
Let's take a phone call from a nurse practitioner who does a type of psychotherapy, and it's going to relate to some of this history as we go through a 100-year timeline. Shannon in Park Slope, you're on WNYC. Hi, Shannon. Thanks for calling in.
Hi, amazing. Thank you so much for having me. Yeah, my name is Shannon Carroll, and I do Rogerian therapy, which is based on the work by Carl Rogers. And their belief is that you need unconditional positive regard, empathy, and presence in each session that you offer. And so that's what I try to do. And the idea is that people will heal themselves if they experience that type of environment. And I've seen it work, obviously, with guidance and safety measures and understanding of how the work goes. But it's an unbelievable technique, and it's really good for people who are new to therapy because they come in and they're automatically liked. I know that all therapists automatically like their patients, But in Rogerian therapy, it's an extra emphasis, in my opinion. I also like to say that in-person is a different experience than virtual therapy, and I would love to encourage anyone who has access to go in person, because we're supposed to be getting out of our houses and into third spaces, and that's a great way to start.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
So he mentions Carl Rogers. Where does Rogers come in? Was Rogers a disciple of Freud in any way?
Well, Rogers ended up very different from Freud, and the sort of, approval and love and warmth associated with the Rogerian school of therapy is very antithetical to Freud. And it's this call is a nice illustration of how there's now many, many different types of therapy, and some which are incredibly divergent from what Freud started off with. One of the sort of surprising things is that we could be critical about therapy. I think the study of how to cure mental disorders has not been a pure success story, to say the least. But still, therapies tend to be better than not going for therapy. And kind of strangely, just about all therapies have their successes. And some people think it suggests that it's not due to the specific techniques of the therapy, but just having a sympathetic person listen to you with something called a therapeutic alliance, some concern, some hope, some optimism.
And Rogers' heyday was not that long after Freud's, right? Sort of 1940s, 1950s, around there?
That sounds about right.
So the caller talked about empathy. You just mentioned empathy. I think you wrote a book called Against Empathy, didn't you?
I did. We talked about it a while ago.
What does that mean?
In the clinical setting, actually, it means we should make certain distinctions. So I argued in the book, backed up by a lot of therapists, that it's extremely important for a therapist working with you to understand what's going on with you. If that empathy in the sense of understanding. And it's extremely important that they want you to be better. They feel for you. They feel compassion for you. But the argument I made against empathy is that too much connection, where the therapist feels your pain too much, experiences what you feel, can get in the way of the helping process. And there's a lot of evidence that if you're too empathic in that sense, if the patient comes to you and they're anxious and they're sobbing and you're anxious and you're sobbing, you're not going to be a good shrink. You need some sort of clinical distance to do your job well.
Interesting. Another listener writes, "Good morning. When you start with Sigmund Freud, don't forget to mention Carl Gustav Jung." So people do talk about Jungian psychotherapy, if that's the right word, or Jungian analysis or research as kind of deriving from Freud, but taking a next step, right?
Yeah, people do. The Jungian movement hit a sort of popularity. He was Freud's most famous student, and there was this wonderfully interesting dynamic between the two. I think it's fair to say that as a form of therapy right now, it's extremely rare. I never heard of anybody who currently does it. I've seen it. I've read about it in novels. I saw a movie where they had it in. But if you go to a therapist, they're not going to throw some Jungian stuff at you.
How would you describe it or define it, Jungian stuff?
All I connect with Jung is the idea of archetypes, the idea that there's sort of fundamental universal themes that emerge over and over again in the human mind and within each patient. And part of the therapeutic process is wrestling with these archetypes.
Let's take another call. Here's Ellen in Nyack. You're on WNYC. Hi, Ellen.
Oh, good morning. Thank you so much for doing this. Yes, I just wanted to comment. I'm a psychotherapist in Nyack in New York City, and I employ, which I know many other therapists employ, what's called an eclectic approach, where you kind of evaluate your client and see what they need, and that could include cognitive behavior therapy, which can be very helpful combined with medication, and also sometimes psychodynamic therapy, vocational therapy, art therapy, Rogerian, somatic, I do EMDR. So there are many varieties of therapy that can be effectively used rather than being very rigid with one and not bending to what the client might need. The other a comment I wanted to make about Freud, which I feel very strongly about. I have been, I did go and get certified as a psychoanalyst at one time, but I feel that Freud's worldview was very much of his time in protecting the men of his time, the males, the responsible burghers of Vienna, Austria, and wherever he practiced. In that, I've worked a lot with child sexual abuse, and at the time, child sexual abuse, especially from parental figures and caretakers, was taken to be Oedipal complex, where the child was projecting their own fantasies. And I think at that time it was definitely to protect a lot of actual sexual abuse that was going on, to protect the people who were doing it, who might have been very respected or responsible members of that society. And I feel that, for 100 years, that's done a lot of damage to children who are not always believed they are actually being sexually abused.
Ellen, thank you very much for your call. In fact, Professor Bloom, I saw you say in a KCRW interview that to some extent modern psychologists see Freud as if he were some sort of pharmaceutical company that got its start by selling meth. That's some quote.
Yeah. So your caller raises a good point. A lot of, Freud is in for a lot of criticism. Some has to do with his ideas themselves. Some has to do with his personal style, which was often could be very cruel and very ambitious and not entirely honest. The caller's right that one of the issues about Freud is that he heard many stories of sexual abuse, and he chose for whatever reason to see them as fantasies of the patients and not things that actually happened. And that's one of sort of indictments against Freud. I think it's fair to say that his views about men and women, about sexuality, would not export well to modern times. He was very much a man of his time. I also like, by the way, the emphasis on eclecticism, which is a really good point. It's not like we're talking about different schools of therapy, but it's not like there's a psychoanalyst and Rogerians and behavior therapists. Most therapists take an eclectic approach where they use whatever works. At least the best therapists use whatever works. So you might go to a psychiatrist and be given some SSRIs for depression, but also talk about your problems and talk about your feelings, and also get some advice on sort of everyday techniques to make yourself better. And so the best people in the business use many different tools.
Claudia in Manhattan, you're on WNYC. Hi, Claudia.
Hi, how are you? Thanks so much for doing this. So I'm a dyed-in-the-wool psychoanalyst, and I've actually written a textbook about becoming a psychoanalyst. And I think we have to remember that Freud talked about the unconscious, and that CBT and all of the other mindfulness therapies don't help us get to know the parts of our brain that are reflexive. And I think what Freud offers us, as misguided as he was in his methods and in his the way he treated people, was that he gave us theories of the mind so that we understood that we have defenses that keep us from feeling pain. He understood that maybe there was an ego, superego, id, although we don't use that anymore. That was a meta-theory of the mind. And when we deal with mental disorders, we need these meta-theories. Where are the patient's energies going? What are they defending against? How do they experience reality that we want to help them discover? What we've learned since Freud is that interpretations and insight don't work. You can know everything about yourself and it just won't help. So we've replaced interpretation with what's called emotional communication. So instead of falling into the trap of caring too much for the patient or telling them where to go or giving them an attitude adjustment, we want to give them a new experience in the session where we really listen, where we help them see a new way of looking at their own maladies and scratch beneath the surface and look under the hood so they can start to understand their own mind. And this is what we've preserved from Freud and the greatest gift that he gave us.
So how interventionist does that leave you, Claudia, as a psychoanalyst? Because I think the stereotype of the original model is the analyst doesn't say anything, doesn't necessarily give advice, for example, as opposed to just asking some questions that draws out the inner thoughts or, an expression of the subconscious, if that's the right way to put it, from the client.
Well, Freud really believed, and this is, we don't want to have empathy. He really believed we had to get out of our patient's way, and that was his way of doing it. If we do that today, we're getting in the patient's way because it's too frustrating. We want to have a real relationship with our patients, and we want to get in there so that we're no longer strangers to them. That's why psychoanalysis takes so long, because it's not an intellectual process. We become soul-to-soul connections like family, and then we can really get inside, really look under the hood. And it's no longer, the methods are perhaps how psychoanalysis has become most revolutionized. Freud used to hypnotize people. He'd put his hands on people. He told them they wanted to screw their mother. He had a lot of misguided methods, so that's changed a lot.
Yeah. So it sounds
we are
like
no longer the tabula rasa. We get in there with our patient, but we have to make sure that it's not about us.
Are you proud of your field for having evolved so much over 100 years?
What's that?
Are you proud of your field for having evolved so much over 100 years?
I'm so proud of I'm so glad you picked that up, because we need somebody that helps us understand our unconscious. And usually people just react to us the way we induce them to. They get annoyed with us if we're unreasonable, when we're exaggerated. They give us attitude adjustments when we're twisted. And we really do need practitioners who can enter into the world of a patient non-judgmentally and help the patient get to know themselves. It's really the highest form of a love in some ways to have this clinical experience.
Claudia, thank you so much for your call. And let's keep going. Here's another licensed psychoanalyst, he says, Tom in Manhattan. Hi, Tom. You're on WNYC.
Hello. I trained in analysis. And I've been a licensed psychoanalyst for a number of years, but I've seen a sea change in the field from seeing the human being from an objectivist point of view to understanding that we have something called intersubjectivity, which is you are not an object of my observation, but you are a subjective person in your own right. And therefore, the best we can do is have a relationship in which we acknowledge the subjectivity of the other and see what emerges. One of Freud's closest followers was a man named Ferenczi, who believed that Freud was wrong in giving up the seduction theory, that in fact many of our patients are subject to sexual abuse. And for taking that position, Ferenczi was exiled for 50 years. But now he's become an icon. There's a Ferenczi school at the New School. And so all of those years where patients were told that their experience of being sexually abused was fantasy was a great injustice. So I, for one, actually was in an encounter group with Carl Rogers. I also did training in Gestalt therapy. That there is no formula for understanding how to cure mental illness. We have to depend on what emerges unbidden from the relationship rather than to impose a dogma onto our patients.
Tom, thank you so much. One more in this set. Marilyn Brooklyn calling in, I think, to say, unlike has been stated before, Jungian therapy is not dead. Meryl, you're on WNYC. Did I get your gist right?
You sure did, Brian. Thank you so much. Yeah, I mean, I was pretty surprised to hear your guest say that. It's for many reasons. One, there are two very active Jungian training programs in the city, including the C.G. Jung Institute. And the C.G. Jung Institute has a low-fee referral service that is busier than ever. And I really don't understand how that could be. My husband is a Jungian psychoanalyst. I'm a creative arts therapist. I use Jungian techniques within my space. It's a really shocking thing. And actually,
what's an example? What's an example of
like
Jungian
dream
technique?
work, like dream analysis. Your guest mentioned archetypes, but parts work. There's a lot of conversation now in the therapy space about internal family systems that all evolved from Carl Jung's work with parts, which is like sort of considering all the different ways in which your different aspects of you that are protected or like subconscious, unconscious.
Mara, let me ask you a question, since you're connected to the field in the ways you describe, from a listener. I'll throw this to you. A listener writes in a text message, how can people figure out what style of therapy is best for them without having to hop from therapist to therapist?
Sure. Well, first you should speak to different therapists to get a sense of first if there is the possibility of a therapeutic alliance, but also it's really understanding what your goals are going into the space. People go into therapy for a variety of different reasons. One of your other callers talked about the short or long-term goals, right? So there's plenty of people who are going in to address particular anxiety or what have you, and certainly CBT or DBT and those kind of things for that can be useful. But to go deeper, you want to be working with someone who does more depth work.
Meryl, thank you very much. Anything to add on that question, Professor Bloom?
All of these callers seem like to be great therapists. I could tell a certain compassion, interest in other people, an ability to listen and be constructive. I guess I'm not, to go back to something, I'm not myself as proud of the progress for the last 100 years. And one of the reasons is that all these specific claims are being made. I'm not sure that the claims that are rooted in Freudian ideas are actually true. And a lot of people are skeptical. So one of your callers talked about getting at repression and unconscious drives and all that when it comes to treating somebody. And I think there's reason to doubt that that's really the best technique. If you're suffering from severe depression or anxiety attacks or panic attacks, it might be your problem doesn't have anything to do with defense mechanisms and hidden conflict. It might have to do with neurochemical imbalances. It might have to do with maladaptive ways of living. It might have to do with a terrible life circumstance. And these things are addressed in better ways than the sort of talk therapy that we've been going over.
When did medications to treat emotional or mental conditions get introduced in this 100-year history?
I think medications started to get used from the get-go. There were pretty soon after Freud, there were various attempts to treat people with different drugs. It really hit its stride with the development of SSRIs, drugs that influenced the neurotransmitters like serotonin and dopamine. And I think these medications do well. I think that they help people some of the time. I also think, to be fair, and maybe here I'm on the side of the Freudians, that their efficacy is often really overstated. Anybody who's gone to a psychiatrist for help and been prescribed medications will know sometimes they work, sometimes they don't. Sometimes they have awful side effects. Sometimes you have to try one, then try another, and so on. So it's not like antibiotics or something that a success story. You would hope that in the next decade or so we'll come up with something better. But honestly, over the last, say, 25 years, there hasn't been significant progress. Medications work so-so, and that's the way they were 25 years ago.
We'll continue in a minute and finish up on this 100 Years of 100 Things series on a segment on 100 years of psychoanalysis and other psychotherapy with Paul Bloom, Professor Emeritus of Psychology at Yale and author of Psych, The Story of the Human Mind, and more of your calls and texts. Stay with us. Brian Lehrer on WNYC. A few more minutes in our 100 Years of 100 Things segment for today and 100 Years of Psychoanalysis and other psychotherapy. Another landmark researcher of the mind from the last century who I haven't mentioned yet, also very controversial in retrospect and maybe in his day, was B.F. Skinner, who's credited with developing theories of behaviorism. Here's a clip of Skinner in 1971. He's explaining the idea of operant conditioning to produce and reinforce certain behaviors. We pick it up as he's about to demonstrate reinforcement of a desired behavior on pigeons.
The consequences of behavior are as important as its antecedents. And things happen to an organism after it behaves and have a very important effect on it. And the effect is to make it more likely that the organism will behave in the same way again. And that is what is called operant conditioning. Food to a hungry organism, a hungry pigeon, is what we call a reinforcer. And all I can do with this switch is to make that reinforcer occur at the proper time.
So we only have a few minutes left in the segment, Professor Bloom. Was there a social or political or cultural context to B.F. Skinner? Because I know that one of the things with respect to your book is that you try to place it not just in the realm of individual pursuit of happiness, but also what's going on in the culture.
Yeah, so Skinner's a fascinating figure, and he was, to some extent, a reaction to Freud. So Freud said we have all this crazy stuff in our heads, these weird sexual desires, these complicated feelings, dreams, and all of that. And Skinner rejected all of that, went to the other extreme, said there's nothing in the head. We can just talk in terms of reinforcement and punishment, and a human is no more complicated, no more interesting than a pigeon. And so Skinner developed his theory of operant conditioning and used it as a way to make people's lives better, he argued. And also he had a sort of social program. He wanted to use his techniques to make society better, figure out ways to reinforce good behavior and punish bad behavior. He wrote a book, Walden 2, where he sketched a utopian society based on these principles. And I think in some ways Skinner has done worse in history than Freud. At least, we still respect a lot of Freud's core ideas. The idea that there's no such thing as thoughts, no such thing as ideas, that you can do a psychology that doesn't take those into account, is something I think nobody takes seriously now. But a lot of the techniques that Skinner developed in terms of training animals and very low-level techniques involving reward and punishment are still used. And, they call it cognitive behavioral therapy. The cognitive part Skinner would have hated. But the behavioral part he would have got behind. The idea is that we should encourage sort of adaptive behaviors, discourage maladaptive ones. So in some way, while the theory of Skinner isn't, that worth taking seriously, his techniques have lived on.
Yeah. Interesting. Here's our last listener comment. Listener writes, I'm 44 years old and have been in therapies since I was 19. I love the fact that your guest touched on how the field hasn't really progressed much, especially in the way of meds. And in our last minute or so, you have said that the field has been stagnant for about the last 30 years, and you've called it a young science. So can you reflect on that, and then we're out of time?
Yeah, I think a lot of clinicians might disagree with me, but I've talked to people and I've talked to experts, and the progress has been limited. We have made progress actually in areas such as making therapy more available to people. So I think in person might be better than virtual, as somebody said, but still the accessibility of therapy online makes therapy available to so many people who wouldn't otherwise get it. There are certain treatments for psychosis that we have that we didn't have before. But still, if you come in and you're sad and you're anxious and you're miserable and you go to a therapist, what you'll be exposed to will not be substantially different from what you've been exposed to 25 years ago. And I think that's worrying. I think we it would be nice if we had a revolution around the corner.
Paul Bloom, professor of psychology associated with the University of Toronto and Yale, and author of the 2023 book, Psych, The Story of the Human Mind. Thank you so much for sharing some of the contents of your mind with us and talking to our callers in this 100-year segment.
Thanks so much for having me on.
And that's the Brian Lehrer Show for today, produced by Mary Croak, Lisa Allison, Amina Cerna, Carl Boisrond, and Esperanza Rosenbaum. Zach Goddard-Cohen produces our Daily Politics podcast. Allison next.